Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. In this episode, as organizations around the world are continuing to adapt, iterate, and refine new working rhythms, I've been exploring another work model, one that has been achieving more visibility recently, the 4-day week. It's not 4 exact work days. It's a time frame, a model defined by reduced hours that seeks not to compress or intensify work, but concentrate on efficiency and effectiveness, aligned with incentives to adapt employee behaviors. The framework is the key, not directly a result of the perceived boundaries it creates as one might expect perhaps, as I did. Instead, the framework prompts the concerted review and redesign of operations, work processes, and practices that are a prerequisite when preparing for a trial project. The internal review is thorough to understand how work is done and how it can be done better. This review exercise is timely for all organizations, whatever model you are contemplating, using, or tweaking, however many hours everyone works now or in the years ahead. This exercise can help your business proactively undertake a broad-based initiative to update systems and workflow for digitalized operations and modern work mindsets and methods, and also consider an interesting framework that might be beneficial for your organization. To understand the model and the process, I'm delighted to be talking to Joe O'Connor. Joe is the director and co-founder of the world's first Center of Excellence in Worktime Reduction, a new global initiative being launched in partnership with Curium Solutions, a leading people-first transformation company. Before this, Joe was the CEO and global pilot program manager of 4-Day Week Global, where he led the design and implementation of 4-day week trials all over the world, supporting over 200 employers and 10,000 employees to make the transition to reduced hour, productivity-focused working in 2022.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
Hi, Sophie. Great to see you again.
Very good to see you. I'm anticipating learning even more than I did when I met you for the first time. Starting off at the beginning, what did you study at college?
So originally I did accountancy, which I'm going to be honest with you, I graduated from, and at that point I had enough accountancy. I didn't see myself going on and making a career as an accountant. So I did a master's in business strategy and innovation management. And then probably hung around college for a few years longer than most people. I was involved in the Students' Union. I was the National Students' Union President of Ireland after I finished college. And that probably has had as much of an influence on my career path as what I actually studied all those years ago.
Ah, interesting. All right. So you had that leadership in you and that drive early on. How did you first get interested or start looking into the whole idea of the 4-day work week?
So I actually came at this from the other angle or the other perspective. Most of my work now is working with employers, with leaders, with people managers. But I used to be the head of campaigns with Ireland's largest public sector labour union. As a result of that, I was leading a research project within the Irish Public Service, which was looking at work-life balance and looking at a whole range of related issues. But one of the things that really stood out for me from that work was that we discovered we had a lot of working parents, mostly women, unsurprisingly, who were already working shorter work weeks. They had voluntarily chosen to reduce their work time for childcare commitments, often coming back off maternity leave. They had taken a pay cut to do this. But when we interviewed their managers and when we interviewed their employees themselves, almost universally their experience was that my demands haven't changed, my responsibilities haven't changed. Effectively, I'm getting the same amount of work done now as I used to do when I was working 5 days. So that's what really got me interested in this idea of Parkinson's law, that a task expands to fill the time available for its completion. and started looking into some of the early trials and studies of the shorter work week in Iceland, in Denmark, in New Zealand, and in a number of other countries.
Women were getting the same amount done in the 4 days. Did they feel it was kind of unfair, or they really felt they could be that much more efficient?
I think that it probably was couched in more positive terms then than maybe it would be today. I think that they saw this as a benefit. They saw this as flexibility. But I think it really shone a light on what is the reality in a lot of modern organizations and in modern work, that there has been quite a bit of creep. And we've seen a lot of, inefficiencies, which technology and which advances in productivity should have helped us to streamline. Instead, we've seen an expansion in terms of work. And I think that this was an example almost of Parkinson's law in reverse, where introducing that intentional time constraint was a forcing function for these individuals to get better at the way that they were working. And I think it then makes you ask the question, well, if individuals can do that, well, what about if we took a structured approach where we do this across teams, across departments, across organizations, where in addition to that individual incentive, you introduce a collective incentive where people are challenged to find better ways to work together as a collective.
Absolutely. And what was driving these countries, Iceland, the Netherlands, a good number of European countries, don't have a 40-hour work week. From talking to a friend of mine in the Netherlands, she thought it's 32 hours now that the average person is working. What has been the impetus in different countries to reduce the work week? And how was that informing and inspiring the progression of your interest in the 4-day work week?
So you're right. I think if you look at OECD data on competitiveness, on productivity, and on hours worked, you see a lot of European countries like Germany, like the Netherlands, like most of the Scandinavian countries are coalescing somewhere in the mid-30s in terms of average work time. Obviously, we know it's higher than that in the UK, in Ireland, and here in North America. So I think that in itself, very clearly shows that there is not a linear relationship between hours worked and productivity. And I think that if you look at the growth of the shorter work week movement, particularly in recent years, it tends to come from different places depending on the structure of that country's economy. So we've seen, certainly in parts of Europe, this is something that's either been driven centrally by government or through the collective bargaining process. We see pilot projects now being launched in Spain and in Portugal, whereas here in North America, it's tended to be very private sector driven. So we're seeing individual organizations, forward-thinking leaders, with cultures of experimentation and trust, being the ones who lead the way in the US and Canada for sure.
On a country basis, there have been these much bigger projects or overall change that's been happening. How did that happen in these bigger environments? In the US, where so much happens through the private sector first, I'm just curious as to the involvement of the public sector and whatever it was that was helping the momentum and success of the implementation.
Yeah, I think in those countries, you're seeing the public sector with a role as a vanguard, which is kind of starting to advance improvements in terms and conditions, and then the private sector catching up. If you take the Icelandic example, this was a scenario where between 2015 and 2019, it was in small parts of the public and private sector where the government kind of sponsored these experiments. And then over time, this was then expanded to more than 85% of the Icelandic economy. But this is something that, this is not a new thing. For decades and centuries now, the idea that advances in productivity and technology can be shared in the form of reduced work time, has been an age-old reality. And I think all that's happened is in parts of Europe, this is still happening to some extent, but it has slowed down in recent decades. And then you could argue that in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, that it's almost stopped. And we see this in the data that in the last 20 to 30 years, despite global trade, despite email, despite the internet, all of these things that have made us, by a large number of degrees more productive at an individual level, this has not necessarily led to any significant change in the work week.
You say 85% of Iceland. So who are the holdouts and why are they holding out, or do you not know?
I'm not sure. I think a lot of it is down to collective bargaining coverage. So it was expanded outwards through various different agreements. It is important to say that when you look at Iceland, this is not saying that everyone in Iceland is working a 4-day work week. This is work time reduction. I think it's valid to say as well that they reduced from a baseline of 39 down to people are now working 34, 35 hours, which is similar to what the average is in a number of other European countries already.
Right.
So there are different ways to achieve the same outcome. And I think depending on the country, you're probably going to see different levers, different actors being the ones that kind of lead this movement.
Right. I do want to just set a baseline of understanding that a 4-day work week means effectively, and please correct me if I'm wrong, 32 hours. However, obviously different companies can have different models, and it doesn't mean necessarily at all that a company has 3 days where nobody's working. And it doesn't mean that somebody might not be working at different times over 5 days or more. This is a reduction from the 40 hours standard, and it can be constructed in all kinds of different configurations. Is that correct?
It is. I would say the 4 days, 32 is the gold standard. We have seen organizations that have moved to shorter work weeks where it might be a more incremental step. So, for example, they move from 40 to 34, 35, 36. So it's slightly longer days, but an overall net reduction in hours over the course of the work week. Really, the central premise of this is a trade between employer and employee, where on one side there's a commitment to a genuine reduction in hours for the same salary, and on the other side there's a commitment to maintaining output, which in itself assumes some form of increase in terms of hourly productivity. So that's tended to be the basic structure, and then underneath that you have all kinds of variants. And you're absolutely right. The idea that the 4-day week or even work time reduction is just about Fridays off for everyone is not the case. In fact, a minority of organizations in the recent UK trial adopted a shorter work week with that exact model. It really depends on your business. And sometimes if you're talking about a bigger organization, it might even depend on your team or your department, where there's different interpretations under one unified framework.
I'm always harping on about flexibility and the fact that in the business environment that we're working in, we need to have so much flexibility. And this is one way of doing it. To rewind a little bit, you were finding out this research, looking at the working mothers. And then you also did a period at Cornell doing some research. What were you focused on there specifically? And was that coming on the back of this research that you'd done in Ireland?
Yeah. So around the time that the pandemic happened, I was talking about this issue, active on this issue, had supported a small number of companies to do this in Ireland. And then all of a sudden, the interest in this just skyrocketed. So I organized the first pilot program and research project on this.
Because of the pandemic?
Because of a combination of two things. One of them was just a kind of practical reality whereby there were more companies and more leaders getting in touch with me and with our group, 4-Day Week Ireland, saying, we want to try this out. And we had very limited capacity and limited resource. So there was a practical consideration of, okay, how about we create a coordinated group where we can support these companies together and they can support each other. And then part of it was seeing a strategic opportunity that so many things were changing. We believed that this concept was something that could work. And here was a chance to kind of really sponsor a large scale test of this. So started that in Ireland and moved to the States to lead that project in Cornell. Took over as CEO of 4-Day Week Global. So the work I was doing in Cornell was linked to these trials and working with Professor Juliet Shore in Boston College, who was leading on the research for these particular trials.
And what was the framework for the trials? How many countries, how many companies and sectors that you wanted to try and include in the trials to be able to get the greatest variety of data to be able to prove a point?
Honestly, I would love to say that it was quite that intentional in terms of participation, but it was simply if you're interested in being part of it, get in touch. And we were fortunate that both in terms of volume, but also in terms of diversity, that we ended up getting a great spread. I mean, I really want to emphasize when I started this in Ireland, we were looking at how do we put in place a framework to help 5 or 6 SMEs. This ended up, mushrooming to something that hundreds of companies participated in. And really part of the work that I'm doing today is, I guess, responding to the reality that I discovered over the course of these pilots expanding, that for some companies, they need more support than we were able to provide through that kind of very self-guided, very light touch program. If you're bigger, if you're more complex, if you're in areas like professional services or manufacturing, it's going to be a heavier lift. And we kind of felt there was a need to put in place the infrastructure to support that.
There are many options, and I don't like to be prescriptive. That's a key thing for me. When so much is changing, when we have so many new tools, when we understand that we have such different ways of working and it all goes to this how, and the investigation into how a person, a team, and a company operates and works. How did the realizations come to you about what that meant and how to approach it?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is I think part of the reason why some leaders and some organizations are resistant to this idea is because I think how it gets interpreted in the media, it's very outcome driven rather than process driven. It's focused on the results rather than how organizations did this.
Right.
And as a result, it can almost feel unbelievable. And there's some people that will have this, magic beans approach to the 4-day week where you reduce people's time by 20% and hey presto, there's a 20% uplift in productivity. And I really want to kind of get to the nub of that and say, yes, there are some individual gains to be had here. In other words, if you move to a shorter work week, is it likely that as an individual, you're going to be better rested, you're going to be more focused, you're going to have less task switching and flow switching as a result of out of work commitments? In other words, we see that typically people will take their healthcare appointments, other commitments that they need to do on their scheduled day off, which means they're focused. So there are individual benefits of this. We see some data that people spend less time browsing on social media, but that is not 15, 20, 25% of inefficiency, of unlocked potential. The real magic in this comes from framing this as a project which is not just about changing the number of hours that you work, but changing the way that you work. And so it's a bottom-up challenge to your employees, which is really about redesigning the way that they and their teams function.
Or designing for the first time.
Right. Yeah.
Let's be real about this. I mean, for me, that's the key. And this has been a huge merger. Most people have just done what the boss before them did because they were taught, and it was just the best case of incremental improvements.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we do an exercise with organizations around process mapping, which is about figuring out what are the steps in the process, who's involved, what are the interdependencies between teams. And we talk about on-system and off-system tasks. And often, it's the off-system tasks. In other words, the stuff that it's not documented, it's not designed, it happens. This is how it's always been done. That's where a lot of the inefficiency and the optimization lies.
Then, of course, the pandemic comes along and everything changes. So that was an incredibly interesting moment because the process needed to change dramatically. And so allowed people to have more understanding of what the processes were like, because they'd had to actually try and understand them more when so many people were sent home, and then to adapt them from there. Is that what you were finding?
It is. I think, and this won't surprise you given my background, I've probably moved from a much more purist viewpoint on this issue to a more practical one over the years. And it's come from the realization that, both things can be true. Yes, it's true that we have the productive capacity and the technological tools at our disposal to make this happen, to make this shift as a society on a grander scale. But there's also a reality that for the organizations that are doing this today, the early adapters, the first movers, becoming a 4-day work week company in a 5-day week world where most of your clients, your competitors, your stakeholders are all working 5 days is not an easy thing. And that's why if operational excellence isn't at the heart of this, in other words, if this isn't conditional on, improving the way that you work and on achieving very real outcomes and objectives, there's a strong chance that it might fail. And so that's really at the core of how this works for companies.
I hear you, Joe. And At the same time, that's why I spend a chunk of time on what's going on in Europe, because the Netherlands, for example, it's a small country. It is one of the most competitive countries in the world. And they are working on average around 32, 33 hours a week. So they have worked out how to stay competitive and not be working the same hours. And that is also based on the fact that in Europe, people have between 6, 8, 10 weeks holiday a year. And yet the countries are competitive on the world stage. So for me, there is an important mindset shift, which I think is going to take time, and it is happening. So when you're going into a company, how do you help them focus on this mindset shift, really, in terms of how they're thinking about designing or redesigning the processes, what the workflow looks like, and being realistic? What do you try and help them aim for as they're going about the rationalization and trying to make things so much more effective?
So I might just talk about the first step in the process for most organizations we work with, which is, we call it the diagnostic phase. And we're really about trying to answer three questions. And we're engaging with employees through surveys, through group sessions. We do some meeting observations, process reviews. And we're trying to answer three questions. The first is, how ready is this organization to move to a shorter work week? Because not every organization is ready. It takes a certain type of culture. It takes a certain type of, operational efficiency. The second is, what are the constraints and challenges that are going to potentially determine success or failure? So in other words, it's almost like a pre-mortem. What are the things that could go wrong? And how do we plan for that? How do we manage for that? And then the third is looking at the pros and cons of different structures and different models. And this is what we were talking about earlier. Is it going to be a universal scheduled day off because it's more important that your team are available to each other and you increase that coordination and collaboration across 4 days? Is it going to be a roster or a shift because it's really important that you have that service coverage for your clients? Or is it going to be a more incremental approach where it's, shorter days, 9-day fortnight, half-day Friday? And I think your point around mindset is really important, because often we find the companies where it's mostly an operational challenge is where it's easier. If this is just a down and dirty process improvement project, that's much easier. Where you've got, we're working with an architecture and design firm at the moment where they've got an incredibly strong, rich culture, really, really strong, rich culture. But sometimes that materializes as almost, thriving on the intensity of the work. So people who are very, very married to this very busy, high tempo environment. And so kind of shifting that kind of culture, that mindset, that is a much bigger journey than just saying, we need to improve X, Y, and Z processes.
I'd love to go through all three of those step by step. You said it depends on the culture. And so you've just given an example of one aspect of a culture where it's very strong. At the same time, it's also not necessarily optimized for the change. How would you coin that in terms of what that kind of culture looks like that's really the most ready?
I would say it comes very much down to trust, autonomy, and experimentation. So it's organizations for whom, number one, the most detail-oriented CEO in the world does not know the day-to-day intricacies of everyone's job well enough to tell them how they need to design it or redesign it. So if you've got a top-down command and control style leadership, this is probably not going to work. So it relies on that very bottom-up approach where there's a partnership between employees, managers, leaders. And also I think the experimentation aspect is really important because, there are some leaders and organizations that I've been talking to about this idea for probably 4 years now. And they are bought into the concept, but they feel like they need to solve every single possible problem before they start. And there's an element of this where no matter how, I think that we help organizations be pretty well prepared for this, but no matter how much planning you do, there are going to be things that you need to adjust. You need to course correct. You need to fail.
I would be curious to find out if that attitude hadn't changed during the pandemic, where we had to deal with so much and people rallied and we got through it and we couldn't possibly mitigate every risk. We had no idea what was ahead. So I would echo back to those times because they did give us some learnings about the future of work, about modern work and about the digitalized workplace. We're needing to iterate and course correct and adjust frequently because of customers changing behaviors and those type of things. So one would hope that there's more recognition of this being inevitable.
I would love if, everyone banked those learns and, but I think you and I both know that, for some organizations, there's been quite a degree of backsliding and, the opportunity to get back to the way we used to do things couldn't come quickly enough.
What other small and larger red flags that come up in the pre-mortem, helping identify where the challenges might be, and some maybe surprising ones, as you saw trials roll out in different countries and with some differences in how people reacted in different places?
Yeah, I mean, the headline ones, meetings, collaboration, technology, processes. But I think some of I wouldn't say red flags, but some of the bigger hurdles to overcome, sometimes it can be, certainly in professional services, this attitude of when the client says jump, we say how high, and trying to reset boundaries and expectations is not an easy thing. No. So, and sometimes this is actually, it's a productivity as well as a well-being question, because if you've got a work style where, as soon as a demand comes in, you task switch, then that's going to be a productivity problem for your people as well. The other one I would say is workload management, resource management. So organizations where, you can find all the efficiencies and optimizations at a team level as you want. But if leadership and management have got a very, in other words, if you're an organization where you accept every project, you put unrealistic timelines in place, you have a poor way of, resourcing teams, and that's going to be very difficult for people to overcome just by optimizing their own work. So that's another very important aspect.
The good thing is there's much more understanding and empathy about what some response times mean for clients. At the same time, client feedback cycles and expected response times have gone through the roof too. So I think that makes it a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think proactive, open, transparent communications with your clients is so important. I mean, I've only seen a handful of occasions where companies have reported to me, we've lost a client because we moved to a shorter work week. I think the majority of people are interested in this. They've heard about it. They're fascinated to see how it works. And a lot of it comes down to just being clear that the reason you're doing this as a leader or as an organization is to address the exact things that your clients care about: quality, turnover, burnout. Yep. These are things that actually are very linked to delivering for your client. I think making that clear from the off is so important.
Yes, absolutely. You can't treat customers well and then not your employees well. But by the same token, if you're looking to optimize things for employees and that might have an effect on customers, then all of that needs to be discussed. And the customers are so much more open to understanding these things now, which I think is really beneficial. So in terms of the pros and cons of the different model, the diagnostic test at the beginning, I think, is probably more about the process, what needs to be thought through, what are the possibilities. How often does senior management have a definitive idea about which model they think they're going to be comfortable with? Obviously, how they operate and how many days they need to have covered. How often do they stay with the same model that they had the idea that this is what's going to be appropriate, or change and adapt and maybe iterate over time as well?
Yeah, we definitely have organizations who, when they come to us, have a hard and fast view about the way that they want to do it. And often that's from a place of knowledge, of knowing their own business and how it works. Right. We do have occasions where they envision one thing and they end up doing another once we've done that process. I would say that there's probably three very significant variances. The first is I've seen some organizations where leadership has the ambition to move to a shorter work week, but their people are already way overworking their existing contracted hours. So this, in the first instance, is how do we get greater balance within the existing work structure before we even envision, chopping a day or a half day off the work week. The second is sometimes it's clear engaging with employees that they need a longer lead in, they need more preparatory time. So we might recommend, an incremental implementation, a more graduated approach, which allows for a little bit more of a lead in. And then the other one that I would say is very important is thinking about, how you interact with your clients, which is the piece around rosters versus scheduled day off, but also thinking about, we've seen companies who have started with a model where they're doing one thing in one team and doing one thing in another, which is very well intended in that sales have figured out this is the best thing for our team. Marketing have decided this is the best thing for their team. They're a little bit different. And then you start the trial and you realize, okay, we haven't really thought about how this impacts how we actually interact with each other. So that's a really important piece, is looking at the interdependencies within your own teams. And it's not just about, what's going to get our output done, what's going to, create the greatest flexibility for our people. We actually need to think about how this is going to impact how we work with other parts of the organization as well.
And how do you facilitate the unit or team agreement and then the department agreement? And now in the more complex business environment, that there's so much more across departments and needing to bring together teams which are interdisciplinary. How are you helping companies try and work out how to go across those? It goes to the hybrid work model in the same way in terms of coordinating these different schedules, as well as the types of tasks people are doing to be optimizing for their own specific effectiveness.
Yeah, I think it comes down to understanding the trade-offs inherent within each and then planning for that. And, I think if you take the model where you have a roster-based system where some people have Mondays off and some people have Fridays off, it's a very common model, but sometimes organizations overlook the reality that now effectively your available collaboration time cross-team has been reduced to 3 days, which is not an insurmountable hurdle if it's planned for, but it's definitely something that you need to have kind of recognized and built in appropriate handoffs, built in appropriate collaboration time within that available window that you now have.
Sure. And going back to leadership have the ambition to change the work week. However, people were already way overloaded, because I would imagine in the US, that could be a lot of companies.
Yeah. To your point earlier, I think one other misunderstanding about the shorter work week is that this is a very rigid model. And actually, this is not about eliminating flexibility. This is not about eliminating discretionary effort. If you look at most companies that have done this, there are going to be occasions where there's an emergency, there's a project deadline, you need to flex on a Friday. It's more about moving the needle on the standard expectation.
Okay.
And I think for those organizations that, let's say you're a law firm, once we get underneath the bonnet and we actually look at the organization, people are working 55, 60 hours a week. Is it going to be helpful in that scenario to move straight to a 4-day work week? Most probably not. We talk about this as about redesign rather than intensification and speed up. I think in that situation, the gap is too large to be able to avoid a scenario where people just feel overburdened with that. So I think it is about bite-sizing it. It is about how do we move to a scenario where there is greater control, reduced unsustainable workloads. And maybe, after a year, after 2 years, maybe you're now coming from a position where, thinking about something like a 4-day work week is going to be much more achievable for you.
And what do you say to those executives who say, well, why should I still pay them the same? Really, we should be increasing productivity for 40 hours. What's your response to them?
Well, I think there is this argument that, if there's 20% of waste, inefficiency, and unlock potential, if that capacity is there, then we should just make it happen, bank it against EBITDA, and forget about this shorter work week nonsense. But the reality is, if organizations could do that, they would have done it by now. And it overlooks the psychological, behavioral element of this, which is this is an incredibly powerful incentive. And we're coming from a baseline and a reality that I think if you ask most people, do you believe that you're getting 40 hours worth of, highly productive, hyper-focused work out of your employees at the moment? Do you recognize that for a lot of organizations, Friday afternoons are a dead zone already. I mean, if you accept and appreciate that that's the baseline, then surely offering people this incentive and putting much more structure around, what you're getting back in return is likely to be good for your organization, rather than kind of, clinging on to something that probably isn't even a reality in the current moment anyway.
Sure. And just to be as transparent as possible, you've had so many incredibly powerful and positive reactions at the end of trials and people continuing the 4-day work week. What about some of the ones who didn't decide to continue, in terms of why they chose not to? And what did you learn from that can improve better preparation or choices or a sector?
I mean, I have learned so much from the kinds of leaders and companies that I've had the opportunity to work with over the years. And I would say, there's a part of it. This is an art rather than a science. Like lots of the companies that introduced this 3 or 4 years ago in a way that today I would probably look at and say, wow, that's chaotic. Leaders who woke up one morning and said, you know what, we're doing it. I mean, in a lot of cases, they made it work in the end. It was probably a much more bumpy, chaotic transition. Right. I think that, organizations today, there are ways to do that in a much more seamless way. But, there is an element of, it's probably my job to overthink this. But for leaders, too much overthinking can lead to stasis. And actually,
sure.
So why do organizations, I would say one thing that's important to say, I am not arguing. Like if you look at the data from those trials, 90% success, 100% success. If you did a randomized control trial across the American economy, would you get that level of success? Absolutely not. I mean, there is some self-selecting bias. It is voluntary. The kinds of organizations that are doing this are the kinds of organizations that are most likely to make it a success. The reason we see companies drop out, the most common ones tend to be either a significant change in terms of something else changes in their business environment. And they're kind of, moving to a shorter work week is a big change project. There's an element of it is a strategic risk. And if your risk profile is here and then it increases to here while you're planning for it, you might say, okay, we're going to put this on the back burner.
Fair enough.
And we've seen some organizations who have hit, barriers or obstacles either from internal stakeholders or from a process perspective that leads to them walking back from this. But, I think that the evidence is in that this is something that many organizations, not all, but many organizations can make work and can pull off. And that if you can, and, I think we've covered, it's not necessarily an automatic easy thing, but if you can, the benefits for, your attraction and retention of talent, for your people, for your organization can be really, really very significant. And that's why you see so much, cheerleading for this, I think, because the companies who have been through this and made it work feel very, very strongly about what it means for them.
For listeners who might be interested in exploring the 4-day work week at their company, what is the best approach for them to bring it to their company? They could be a CEO or a senior executive, but what's the best way to introduce this idea to have the greatest chance of actually moving forward with the trial?
I would say if you're an employee who wants to bring this to your boss or who wants to bring this to your people team, I think a big part of it is frame it in the sense that this is not a benefit. This is not,
right.
Come to this conversation saying, we have thought about, we accept the conditionality of this. So we accept if we try this, it needs to be based on hitting our targets. And we have already started to think about, what are the things we could do differently? What are the things we could change? And I think that approaching the conversation in that way is going to make it much more likely to receive a receptive response. I think if you're the CEO, most of the blockages that we see at that very senior leadership level tends to come from your board. It might come from if you're private equity owned. And I think, pitching something, it doesn't need to be with us, but pitching an exploration process, which is a feasibility study, building the business case, it is probably an easier ask to say, look, this is something that lots of organizations are doing. This is something that most of the data suggests is going to be a bigger part of the world of work in the next 5 to 10 years. as an organization, let's look at this. Let's not commit to doing it right away, but let's at least give this the airing and see how might this work in our organization. And if nothing else, you've done an exercise that in 3 or 4 years' time, if some of your biggest competitors do this first, at least you've got a basis that you can kind of respond from.
Perfect. Anybody listening, that's what you should do if you want to try and bring this to your organization. Thank you so much, Joe. This has been enlightening to really dig into the details of not just the 4-day work week, but how we work and how we can work better and do much more in less time.
Absolutely. I've loved the conversation. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks again so much to Joe O'Connor, director and co-founder of the world's first Center of Excellence in Work Time Reduction. You can follow Joe and the Work Time Reduction Center of Excellence on LinkedIn. And their website is worktimereduction.com. Immediate action tip. To propose a 4-day week trial at your company, pitch a feasibility study to build the business case, recognizing the conditionality of a trial based on hitting targets and offering nascent thinking about what could be done differently. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend and like it. And even write a quick review wherever you listen. For more information to help navigate this period of transformation through regular video updates, curated useful articles, research and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Until next time.